Who's talking right now about the killing of our colleague. Let's listen.
As being essential to inclusive and tolerant societies. It is heart-wrenching to see the killing of another journalist just 1 week later. We call for an immediate and thorough investigation and full accountability. Investigating attacks on independent media and prosecuting those responsible are of paramount importance. We will continue to promote media freedom and protect journalists' ability to do their jobs without fear of violence, threats to their lives or safety, or unjust detention. Her death is a tragic loss and an affront to media freedom everywhere. With that, I'll take your questions.
Thanks.
Matt, I see you have a minder with you today.
Yeah.
I'm very glad to see it. Yes.
My boss, this is Anna. Ned. And,
Good to meet you. We'll talk later today.
yes. On this
Yes.
situation, when you call for an immediate and thorough investigation, who exactly do you want to do that?
It is important to us that those who are responsible for her death be held responsible, that full accountability be ensured in this case.
Okay, but my question is not that. My question is, who do you think can conduct a credible investigation into her death that would be accepted by all parties, including the United States?
Well, in this case, I'm not going to prejudge where any investigation may go. We've seen, of course, that the Israeli Defense Forces have already announced that there is an investigation underway. We welcome that announcement. It is important to us. It is important to the world that investigation be thorough, that it be comprehensive, that it be transparent, and importantly, that investigations end with full accountability and those responsible for her death being held responsible for their actions.
Okay, but I mean, do you want the Palestinians to be involved in the investigation?
The IDF has announced an investigation.
Okay, that's the IDF,
Correct.
I standing for Israel.
That is correct.
So what about the Palestinians? Because there are calls in Israel for the Palestinians to take part in this.
What is, and I'm sure the Palestinians will do their own review as well. We've heard statements from both Israelis and Palestinians over the course of the day. What is important to us is that those responsible for this killing be held accountable for their actions.
Okay, well, all right, so there's one more thing and then I'll defer. But are you confident that, maybe you're not because the investigation hasn't been done, but does it appear to you, circumstances right now, as you know, that she was targeted because she was a journalist?
I'm not going to prejudge an investigation. That's precisely why we're calling for an investigation. We've heard the statements that she was clearly, she was wearing attire that was clearly marked her as a journalist, but we are going to wait for the investigation to go where it goes. We are going to wait to hear where the facts lead in this case, and importantly, to see the accountability that is mounted in the aftermath of that investigation.
Yeah, I just want to ask you, do you trust Israel investigating itself? I mean, I have asked this question over the past 20 years so many times. Do you trust them? Have they ever come back to you with saying, these are the results? I mean, you know, only in January, Omar Assad died in their custody. And you said, and he was a Palestinian American. And you said from that podium, you said that you are waiting on their investigating. You have not even followed through on this. So do you trust the Israelis investigating themselves?
The Israelis have the wherewithal and the capabilities to conduct a thorough, comprehensive investigation. Let me give you an example, because you asked the question. In June of 2020, Israeli police in Jerusalem's Old City fatally shot, and you are familiar with this case, Iliad Halak, a Palestinian resident with autism, after he allegedly failed to stop and to obey orders. About a year later, in June of 2021, the Ministry of Justice's Department for Investigations of Police Officers, DIPO, filed an indictment with the Jerusalem District Court against the border police officer who shot and killed Halak. Clearly, Israeli authorities have the wherewithal to conduct a thorough, comprehensive investigation. That is what we expect in this case. In this case, we expect that the perpetrators, those responsible for the death of Shireen, who, by the way, was a very close contact of our post, someone, our people, someone presumably many of you knew quite well.
She was with us in this room.
It is, and it is important to us.
Remember that.
It is important to us that her legacy be honored, be protected with accountability. for those who senselessly took her life.
Well, on this police case that you cited, just bear with me, indulge me, my colleague, on this case that you cited, the Israelis charged the policeman with something like maybe $10 fine and so on. I don't want to delve into that. But you talked about Press Freedom Day last week. Press Freedom Day. You never mentioned the Palestinian journalists. There are 15 Palestinian journalists in prison. In prison. They're held there, as we say in Arabic, zuran wa buhtanan, which means falsely and malevolently. They have been held there day after day, year after year. They are disallowed from conducting their work, from doing their work, including colleagues of mine from my newspaper. So I want you to respond to that. I mean, you talked about other things, which is laudable, which is great. Talk about what journalists face in Ukraine and other places, but you never mention what Palestinian journalists face.
Saeed, we know what many Palestinian journalists have faced, and we've commented quite a bit on that. You well remember what we said in the aftermath of the strike last year against the Associated Press building, against the Al Jazeera building in Gaza. We had an opportunity to speak to that publicly. Secretary Blinken had an opportunity to speak to the editor-in-chief of the Associated Press in the aftermath of that strike. We have spoken vociferously about the rights to a free press around the world. The fact that reporters should not be targeted, reporters should not be the objects of violence or suppression or repression anywhere around the world. Whether that country is an autocracy, a democracy, whether that country is a friend, or whether that country is a foe or competitor.
Let me just follow up on how journalists, Palestinian journalists, when there is an operation like this, the Israelis were about to storm the Jenin refugee camp. They go by, including the group that was with Shireen, including someone from my newspaper. They went by the Israelis that were standing right out there, and they said, "We're going right there." They told them this morning, "We're going to go right there." So they knew perfectly, they knew exactly who was there and how clearly marked these people were. So I want to hear from you. If ever the investigation shows the guilty party, should that guilty party be prosecuted to the full extent of the law?
Those responsible for Shireen's killing should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
Ned,
Yes.
sorry, just really briefly, since you brought it up, the bombing of the AP and the Al Jazeera office in Gaza, did you guys ever get an explanation from the Israelis that was satisfactory?
We were in contact with the Israelis. They shared with us some of the information regarding that strike.
Did you think that it was a legit target?
Clearly, the fact that there were the offices of at least two independent media organizations made it highly concerning, highly troubling to us. But beyond that,
Is it still troubling, or were your concerns resolved?
it is.
After what
It is.
they told you? I
It
mean,
is.
It's been almost literally, that happened on May 15th of last year. It's now what, May 11th? Or is it the 12th?
It is. That assessment has not changed. It is.
So you're still troubled by it. In other words, the explanation that the Israelis gave to you is not, it did not.
We voiced our concern by the fact that journalists were put at risk, that their offices came under assault.
I get that. It's been but it's been a year, so I just want to know if the Israeli explanation has satisfied you, and so those concerns are you don't have those.
Those concerns still exist.
Will
Yes.
you send someone to the court on Friday for the service of the
I will check with Post. As I know, as I relayed to you, she was a close contact of Post. They were in regular contact with her. They valued her work. They valued, in some cases, a personal friendship and relationship with her. And if we have anything to say regarding representation, we'll let you know. Francesco.
Has the secretary spoken to any leader in Israel or Palestinian side about this? And just to, on the record, do you have any early assessment or understanding of who did that?
We're not going to prejudge an investigation. We've heard various statements throughout the day. Some of those statements have shifted. That's why we've called for a thorough, comprehensive investigation ending in accountability. There have been a number of conversations by senior officials in this building, senior officials at our embassy in Jerusalem, to both Israeli and Palestinian counterparts, conveying many of the same messages I conveyed to you just now. Yes.
Can I briefly ask about Hong Kong and Taiwan.
Sure.
I
First
still have something on Shireen, if I can.
Let's take one more question on this, and then I'll come right back to you,
I
Ned.
have one question too, please.
Okay. Go ahead.
Many press and human rights organizations are calling for international independent investigation into her killings because they condemned Israeli behavior before, that they're not gonna thoroughly investigate themselves. Are you willing to support such efforts to turn this into an international investigation?
Israel has the wherewithal and the capability to conduct a thorough, comprehensive investigation. They've done it before, and we expect they'll do so in this case. Yes.
Do you intend to conduct your own investigation or at least participate, since the lady or our colleague, she's an American Palestinian? Because the record shows that Israeli investigation on those kind of incident haven't been reliable. So I wonder if you are planning to do your part of the investigation.
Our role every time an American citizen is passes overseas, whether that individual, however that individual succumbs, is to provide appropriate consular support. We'll be providing any necessary consular support in this case. But what we are calling for is an investigation, a comprehensive, a thorough investigation that ends with accountability. Thank you.
Yes. On Hong Kong, do you have anything on the arrest of the Catholic Cardinal Joseph Zen? And separately, if I may,
If you're just joining us on Al Jazeera, we've been listening there to the US State Department spokesperson, Ned Price, who has been reacting to the killing of our colleague, Shireen Abu Akleh. He said this is a tragic loss and an affront to media freedom around the world. He said the US calls for an immediate and thorough investigation, and we will continue to promote freedom of speech and the press. He said those responsible for the killing of Shireen should face the full extent of the law. Let's bring in Shiahtanzi, who's at the State Department for us. Quite a heated press briefing there, Shihab.
And it's because of the precedents that we are also aware of, that in the main, Israeli investigations into their own conduct, into alleged war crimes, go nowhere. There was a pretty substantive report in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz just last year, the end of last year, which traced investigations. It's true, Ned Price says, as he kept on repeating, Israelis have the wherewithal and capability to investigate. But do they do this? And then Ned Price pointed to one example, a very rare example, when a Palestinian man with special needs was shot at a checkpoint last year. And after a great deal of pressure, yes, charges were finally brought against a member of the security forces a year later. But that is so rare. That's why it was so notable. We know that in the main, what happens is the Israelis are always very quick to open an investigation, but then they tend to languish for months and months and months, and then when the cameras are off and no one's really paying attention, they're quietly closed in some bureaucratic corner of the Israeli system. Clearly, we're not going to let that happen, but clearly this led to that sort of skepticism from the journalistic core here at the State Department, that how can you possibly hold on to this idea of an investigation which will be substantive and lead to accountability from the Israelis themselves? And then we heard the AP correspondent there talking about the bombing of the Al Jazeera and AP offices in Gaza almost to the day this time last year. And so Ned Price said, oh, they were always very concerned about that. They expressed, they were troubled by what happened, and they asked the Israelis for accountability and investigation. So when the AP reporter in the briefing there said, well, so did you get those answers? Were you satisfied with the answers? All Ned Price could say was, well, those concerns still exist. And that adds to that sense of incredulity that after all of the experience we've had over the years, that the US, when one of its own citizens, by the way, is shot dead by an Israeli sniper, are quite prepared for the Israelis to mount the investigation themselves. And again, the US is not a bystander in this. It's an American citizen who has been killed, our colleague Shireen, and also clearly, the US gives $4 billion a year to Israel, $3.8 billion a year, which underwrites the occupation forces who killed Shireen.
Shihab, thank you for the moment. Shiahtanzi live for us there at the State Department in Washington. Now, the International Center of Justice for Palestinians has demanded an investigation into the systematic targeting of journalists by Israel. The independent organization, which works to protect the rights of Palestinians through the law, said Shireen dedicated her life to one of the most important principles in a democracy, freedom of speech. Journalists like Shireen are crucial in holding governments that violate international law to account. Israel's belligerent and excessive use of force has led to irreversible damage and the killing of innocent journalists. This can no longer be allowed to continue. Well, joining us now is Darren Gutab, who's a journalist and former deputy chair of the International Press Institute. He's joining us from Amman in Jordan. Thank you very much for being with us. I believe you were able to hear some of the comments made by the U.S. State Department spokesperson there when he was pressed by journalists about what the U.S. would do. What did you make of what he had to say?
Well, as always, the words were good. The problem is the action. Whether the words that was said have teeth behind them. You know, we still are in a situation where the U.S. is giving a lot of money to Israel that is totally unaccountable for. There is no conditionality to it. There is no way that this would be controlled if Israel doesn't carry out whatever it promises. And the AP, the destruction of the AP building was just one other example. But there's been so many examples in so many areas in which Israel promised to do an investigation. They haven't done it. But I want to take you even further, because I think what most people don't understand is that Israel does not recognize the existence of Palestinian professional journalists. There are journalists who work for international agencies like the AP or like Al Jazeera, but they're only given accreditation because they work for AP and Al Jazeera. Nobody working for a Palestinian media is even recognized. Israel doesn't even issue press cards or accreditation to Palestinian journalists. Israelis don't even recognize them. They deal with them like they deal with all other Palestinians as being enemy combatants of some kind. And so we have a real problem in that Israel gives lip service. Obviously, when the journalist works for Al Jazeera and happens to be an American, you know, all of a sudden, you know, even the Israeli narrative was changing. At one time, they say, oh, it's a Palestinian who killed her. And then all of a sudden, they changed their narrative because they realized that this was just not another journalist.
But this double standard is not coming just from Israel, unfortunately, is it? I mean, it's coming from everywhere around the world. When you look at the reaction from the international community, yes, our colleague was American and Palestinian. She was working for a major network, but there are lots of other Palestinian journalists who are targeted on a regular basis, and the reaction, unfortunately, is not the same.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. And the problem is that unlike most other countries, you know, Russians kill American journalists. Okay, the Russians are they're not the friends of the U.S. But Israel is a friend and is being supported financially. The veto power is used to support and defend Israel. The Article 7 of the punishment in the UN is not allowed to be used against Israel. So we're not dealing with Iran or with a country that is opposed to the U.S. We're dealing with a strong ally of the U.S. that continues to lie, continues to claim that they are going to investigate. They don't need to investigate. They gave the orders. You know, a sniper who hits the person right below the helmet and above the flank has to be a really good sniper. And snipers don't shoot somebody unless they get orders. So somebody ordered this sniper to kill this woman, this Palestinian woman, who turns out to be an American, but that's not the case. The case is they didn't want anybody to film because they were coming in early in the morning. They wanted to do whatever they wanted to do in Jenin, and they didn't want anybody to record that, to document it. And that's why she was killed.
Do you think, Mr. Gutab, anything more can be done to make things easier and safer for journalists who are working in these kinds of areas in Palestine, in occupied Israeli territories?
On the larger sense, we need to end the occupation. But on the specific question that you asked, we need the state of Israel to be bound by international law in recognizing Palestinian journalists, not Palestinian journalists working for international press, the hundreds of Palestinian journalists who work for Palestinian media. You know, I mean, Shireen had the courage and the support to actually be there. Most other journalists couldn't even be close there, or they would have been immediately taken out. So we need to have recognition of Palestinian journalists. The journalism profession has to be recognized, and there has to be really serious negotiations with Israel on how to deal with the journalists, how to make sure that they're protected, and how there has to be some kind of a memorandum of understanding between the occupiers and the Palestinian Journalists Union to organize how they can work in a safe environment. We don't have any of that. The Israeli Foreign Press Association every now and then talks to the Israelis, but basically the Israelis carry out in the farthest place from Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, in Jenin. That's where all the crimes happen, in Jenin and Gaza, in faraway places, because they know there isn't anybody watching. This time they got caught red-handed, and they got caught killing a well-known household name. You know, I mean,
Right.
I don't know how much you know this, but everybody in the Arab world grows up every day, every night they watch Shireen. She's like a household name. Everybody loves her. She's very quiet. She's very to the point. She doesn't do gossip. She doesn't get emotional. She gives you the information. She was a perfect journalist. I mean, really, she was a really professional journalist.
A huge
and
loss.
we will miss her.
A huge loss for all of us. She was indeed known as the voice of Palestine. Thank you so very much, Mr. Gutab, for joining us. Dawood Gutab joining us there from Amman in Jordan. Well, let's discuss now the role of social media in all this and disinformation, misinformation with Mark Owen, who's an assistant professor of Middle East Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University, where his recent work has focused on the way social media has been used to spread disinformation. Thank you so much for being with us, Mark. Israeli forces issued a video earlier today which they said showed an armed Palestinian firing when our colleague was killed. We know that this is not true, of course. Talk us through the Israeli narrative on this and what you've seen unfold on social media today.
Okay, well, I think what's happening is a classic attempt at propaganda. The Israeli state is very used to managing these crisis situations in which they kill Palestinians, citizens, or journalists. So what they've done is they've already had a narrative, and that narrative is that there was an ambiguity about the killing of Shireen. In this case, there was a possibility that it could have been Palestinians. We know this is very implausible. However, this narrative was put out very early. The video in question was published by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which has a track record in using social media to disseminate falsehood. If you remember recently when Amnesty International released a report accusing the Israeli state of apartheid, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs took out an ad on Google accusing Amnesty of anti-Semitism. So we know that they have these strategies in the pipeline. With regards to Shireen Abu Akleh, they obviously want to use this time, because this time is crucial, and I can't emphasize this enough. This is the moment where there's going to be the most outpouring of outrage and grief about the killing of Shireen. So if they can cast doubt, if they can muddy waters around the death of Shireen by possibly getting newspapers in the international sphere to suggest that she was killed by a Palestinian, they have been successful. And in reality, this is what happened. The Guardian newspaper in the UK and the BBC have already been very clear about putting the Israeli version of events very high up in their reporting of it. And so this is a huge, huge problem, and it's a deliberate strategy, I would say, from the Israeli PR team to try and muddy the waters around the killing.
I was going to ask you, in fact, whether the strategy was working. We've seen, as you've said, international news organizations like The Guardian reposting some of these videos and the narratives anyway. Are people buying this? And how do we fight it?
I think a lot of people aren't buying it, but I think what is crucial is that in any case, I think you asked your previous guest about how we change these things. We need to change public opinion. And for the most part, if you have internationally acclaimed and reputable newspapers putting below the headline the Israeli version of events, which is very implausible, then I think there's a case to be made that people will be influenced by this and that they will think there's credibility to the Israeli side of the story. So I think there's a massive question here for integrity of reporting. How much credibility does an entity such as the Israeli state have to lose through its repeated violations of international law, through it being an apartheid state, before journalists realize that they can't just report the narrative published by the Israeli government? This is a huge issue, and there really needs to be a lot of soul-searching in the journalistic industry about how they narrate the events happening under the occupation.
Soul-searching in the journalistic industry, but what about the role of social media entities like Twitter?
Twitter is a cesspit. We already know from what happened last year in the Gaza bombing, that social media companies tend to have a strong relationship with the Israeli state when it comes to Palestine. They tend to be more censorial about pro-Palestinian content, and they tend to use certain rules and regulations against Palestinians. For example, they might censor Palestinian content based on the fact it's gory. Well, this is because Israeli are launching bomb attacks against Palestinians. Of course, it's going to be gory. If you want to see the reality of war, this favors the person launching the war in the case of Israel and Palestine. So social media companies need to do more in tackling disinformation when it emanates from the Israeli state. But as I mentioned earlier, we've already seen, for example, Google taking ads out or allowing the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel to take ads criticizing a human rights organization of anti-Semitism, which actually violates Google's policy. So